So we're diving into chapter 5 of Jung's Red Book, and this one is called Infernal Journey to the Future.
Ooh,
It sounds,
that sounds
yeah,
intense.
it's definitely a journey into some pretty intense inner landscapes, lots of visions, and we're going to be using this really in-depth analysis that we found to kind of help guide our understanding.
You know, one of the first things that jumps out at me in this chapter is just how much more intense the experiences are getting.
Yeah.
Like he's really pushing into some pretty like uncharted territory psychologically, and I think it's really important for people to remember that, this isn't about being afraid of these things, but about recognizing just how powerful these inner worlds are, and that, it's something that can be navigated, that Jung navigated it, that other people have navigated it.
Right. And I think a lot of us have had those powerful experiences, maybe even some unsettling experiences like visions, and really strong feelings or thoughts that we're kind of hesitant to really look at. So I think it's really significant that Jung was willing to do that. And
Yeah.
it kind of validates that maybe we should look at our own inner landscapes too.
Definitely. And I think the shift in his perspective that leads to this journey is pretty interesting too. He's moving away from that purely rational, scientific view of life and towards something that's much deeper, those aspects of consciousness that are less understood. And I think it really highlights our human tendency to try to like grasp for order, and sometimes we do that at the expense of really acknowledging all of this unknown that's both within us and around us. And I think that this title, Infernal Journey to the Future, really just kind of sets you up to be like, all right, what did he see?
What is he going to encounter here? And he starts off with this pretty powerful first vision. It's a night filled with voices, and one strong voice cries out, "I fall." And then there are all these other voices that are kind of confused, but also kind of in this exalted state. And they're asking, "Whither? What do you want?" And Jung himself is kind of wrestling with whether to trust this confusion. And he talks about this like terrifying sense of like falling into his own darkness, in chaos.
That image of falling is so powerful. Really, I think a lot of people can relate to that because we feel like that in our own lives sometimes where, we're going along and then suddenly all of our, certainties just crumble, whether it's in our careers or our relationships or even just in our fundamental understanding of how things work, even in our emotions. It's like, have you ever had that moment where you just felt like I fall and you're just like, where am I going with no real sense of solid ground? It's like a universal human experience. And it's in this context that he introduces this idea of the spirit of the depths. And he says that this opened his eyes to his inner world, this realm of his soul, which he describes as multiform and transformable. And then he has this vision of like descending along these gray rock walls into this like dark cave that's filled with this black mud. And he notes like the fear that he felt, but also his determination, his will to enter this space.
It's almost like, that journey into the inner cave represents going into that, world of dreams and visions and stuff. I think it's helpful to remember like how the mind works, when we're having these kind of experiences, like it's constantly creating images, processing things. It's almost like, when you read a novel, every person's going to kind of picture the scenes a little differently, in their mind. It's like those visions are going to be super personal, although I do think they're also informed by, our cultural background and stuff too, right? And so he goes on to describe squeezing through these narrow cracks and moving even deeper into this inner cave. That's black water, and he has this compelling vision of a bright red stone, and he feels this urge to reach it. And he talks about wading through this noisy, muddy water, and all these voices are clamoring around him, and he pushes past all of that, and he takes the stone. And he notes his own resistance to these voices around him, and just this deep desire to know more.
And then it gets even more intense, the imagery really ramps up. He talks about listening at this dark opening and seeing a bleeding human head floating on this dark current. And then following that, he sees this huge black scarab beetle also passing in the current, and then a reddish sun glowing in like the deepest part of the stream.
And as if that wasn't unsettling enough, he then had this vision of this ring made up of thousands of serpents that are all coiled on these dark rock walls. And they're obscuring the sun, like there's this dimly shining sun behind them. And then this thick red flow of blood erupts, and it continues for a long time before finally hardening. Just really intense and pretty disturbing imagery.
And, I think it's important to kind of remember that sometimes when we see these really intense images, like that can be the mind's way of processing, really deep-seated fears, and that those fears are often formed by our own individual histories, and also those kind of collective beliefs that we've internalized, the cultural narratives that we've absorbed. So every person's experience of these inner fears is going to be unique.
Yeah. So after these really intense visions, Jung talks about kind of his internal struggle and this really interesting inner dialogue. And he describes pleading with his soul to heal the wounds that have been inflicted by doubt so that he can recognize its suprasense. And he talks about feeling distant and regressed, which is especially interesting given the title of the chapter, Journey to the Future. It seems like he's moving backwards, not forwards.
That whole idea of I am still the victim of my thinking, that's so powerful, right? I think a lot of people can relate to that experience of being trapped in our own thoughts and our own narratives. Like, have you ever felt that? Like you're just stuck in these mental loops,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You can't break free.
Yeah.
And Jung, he talks about wanting to be able to command his thoughts to be silent, to quiet all that noise so that he can clearly perceive the voice of his soul, his inner wisdom and these visions. And he admits that he feels bewildered, but he makes a conscious choice to trust his soul, even if it seems like it might lead him to a place of madness.
Right.
Which is a pretty bold choice.
Yeah. And then there's this metaphor that he uses of the dulling bitter drink. And this represents this process, which is often painful, of confronting and kind of emptying yourself of all those harmful thoughts, those ingrained patterns that don't serve us anymore. It's sort of like that underlying principle of meditation, deep self-inquiry, where you're trying to really understand where all of this negativity comes from.
And it's interesting because he cries out for guidance that goes beyond just the intellect. I mean, he was a man of science, right? But he's recognizing that danger of being so caught up in your own knowledge. Like there's a potential for intellectual arrogance there that I think we all have to watch out for. The source we were looking at mentions that quote of his, "Keep away from me the clever explanation of science," which I think is just so powerful.
Yeah, that's a great one.
There's that real awareness of the limits of purely rational understanding.
Right. And he goes on to ask for protection from this thing that he calls the serpent of judgment.
Right.
Which he describes as something that seems healthy on the surface, but is actually poisonous underneath. And instead of rushing in to try to figure everything out intellectually, he wants to ascend into his own depths in this state of purity, just being open and receptive.
Yeah.
And this leads to his desire to remain in what he calls divine bewilderment, which I think is such a beautiful concept. It's like this intentional state of being open to the unknown,
right,
being willing to experience the miraculous and just resting at the door of his soul, waiting for illumination rather than always trying to grasp it with the intellect.
Yeah. It's a beautiful way to approach it, really surrendering to that. And it leads to this whole paradox that he brings up about madness and divine life. He says that when the desert begins to become fertile and it brings forth all this strange vegetation, that's when people start calling you mad. And he ties this into the idea that certain kind of madness, questioning the norms and venturing into the unknown, can actually be the path to greater understanding. And then he contrasts this with more traditional, Christianity, which kind of avoids those areas.
Right. And it's interesting how in ancient times, madness was sometimes seen as like divine.
Yeah.
But now modern society, we kind of have this fixed view of reality.
Totally.
And anything that falls outside of that is often, dismissed or pathologized.
Yeah.
And Jung's saying that entering the world of the soul, engaging with these deep inner experiences, can actually look like madness to the outside world and sometimes even to ourselves. He says that, no one can consider it more insane than he himself does, which I think is pretty powerful.
It's like he's transcending that conventional idea of sanity.
Right.
In order to really, delve into these deeper truths.
Right. And he distinguishes between what he calls divine madness and sick madness. And divine madness, he says, is this dominance of the spirit of the depths over the more superficial spirit of the times. It's that deliberate engagement with the deeper parts of the psyche, whereas sick madness is when that balance gets thrown off. It leads to more inauthentic expressions.
Right.
Or this kind of fixation just on the surface without any real connection to that inner world.
He even talks about how he felt completely overwhelmed by the spirit of the depths, how it challenged and overthrew the conventional spirit of the times within him, and that the power of this change came from engaging with his soul. All that time he spent really looking inward.
Right, and he talks about the beauty and terror of love, the soul, and God, and how, these ancient attempts to bring divine beauty into the world led the spirit of the times to believe that it had, achieved this ultimate understanding.
Right.
Almost like it thought it was superior to the divine.
Yeah. But he also has that warning, that being touched by the spirit of the depths can evoke these really powerful feelings of cruelty and torment because, as he puts it, it's pregnant with iron fire and crime.
Oh,
So it's
that
not
was
all, love and light and roses, right?
right. And the analysis that we were reading points out that we each interpret these really personal experiences through our own, cultural lens and the knowledge we already have and our
Yeah.
own personal history. And I think it's also important to note that the really disturbing nature of Jung's imagery might also be shaped by his own struggles. And the time period, he was writing this leading up to World War I, so there was a lot of global upheaval and anxiety.
And the symbol of the black scarab is really important here. It represents death that is necessary for renewal, and that ties into, concepts like transmutation and metanoia,
Right.
that shift in perspective, the myth of the phoenix, self-realization, even just the transformation of old thought patterns, through the power of consciousness.
And then there's the whole concept of the son of the depths. And it vivifies what's dead, leading to this struggle between light and darkness. And this powerful source of blood emerges. And it's interesting that this vision occurred right before World War I, which suggests this kind of deep psychic awareness of what was coming.
And then there's that line, where he says, life does not come from things, but from us, And that really resonates with so many different teachings, ancient and more modern teachings, emphasizing the power of our inner state to kind of shape our external reality.
Right. And he goes on to say that the meaning we give to things, it doesn't come from the things themselves. We create it. Like he uses the example of a tree. He says the word tree is just a label. It's not the tree itself. And I think what he's getting at is that meaning and purpose, they really have to be sought within ourselves.
And that leads to this idea that what we need actually comes from inside us, the meaning of things, which is essentially the path to our own salvation, a path that we create. It's really empowering because it's like we don't have to constantly be looking outside of ourselves for validation or for answers.
He talks about the super sense, and he says it's not in the thing itself or even just in the soul. It's the God within.
Right.
Mediates between the two. It's like this bridge to the other side. He even calls it the kingdom of God within.
Yeah. And it's interesting because he realized that he couldn't have foreseen those future events like the war without seeing them reflected inside himself first.
Right.
So it's like that consciousness is really crucial for transformation, both on a personal level and on a collective level.
He even says that he recognizes his own participation in what's happening. Both the crime and the son of the depths are within him.
It's like that recognition that we all have the capacity for both destruction and creation inside of us. It's that kind of yin and yang.
Right. And he's saying that when we don't recognize those inner conflicts, when we avoid our own darkness, all of that unresolved stuff gets projected out into the world and it manifests as violence and destruction on a larger scale.
Yeah. And he's saying that humanity's still at this point where we're attacking our brothers, externalizing the conflict instead of really looking inward.
And he even suggests that maybe this upheaval and suffering is necessary for us to grow up, to really turn inward and do the work.
It's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But important.
Yeah. And then there's that idea of renewal that comes from this source of blood after the veiling of the sun. So that death and destruction are necessary for new life to emerge.
It's a powerful image.
Yeah.
But he also cautions that even when the sun of the depths is shining, after the ego has kind of died, everything that seemed finished can come back to life. And these venomous serpents, they can try to obscure the light again. And it brings night and confusion. It's like that reminder that the ego is persistent.
Right.
It's a process,
Yeah. And he emphasizes that everyone is going to have to experience the atrocities and the cruelties that humans inflict on each other. And the real work is confronting and overcoming all that darkness within ourselves.
That's where it starts.
Yeah. And then he introduces this idea of the condemned hero. These are the people who commit these destructive acts, but they're actually unknowingly manifesting these profound truths.
It's kind of a paradox, right?
Yeah. And he talks about how the ego's will is limited.
Yeah.
And the anonymous spirit of the depths leads us toward what the ego can't achieve on its own. So pushing beyond our current capacity without developing virtue, it's not going to work.
Right. And it leads to this really interesting idea that instead of trying to get rid of our impotence, we should actually give it life.
Yeah.
It's like our perceived weaknesses can actually be internal gains in aptitude.
And finally, he talks about how the ego is dominated by these ideas about what's good and what's indispensable and what we have to achieve and what we need to suppress. And he sees that as a kind of tyranny. It works against the natural flow of life.
It's a really powerful chapter,
That's
you
right.
know? It's intense.
Yeah, it's really intense, but I think it's important to remember the context. His personal journey, the historical events that were happening.
Totally. It's about inner transformation and confronting the depths of the psyche,
Yeah.
the deepest secrets of the psyche.
Yeah. So we've talked about Jung's descent into his unconscious
Hmm.
and all those powerful images representing our fears and conflicts, the idea that death and destruction can be precursors to renewal, that life and meaning come from within us.
Right. And the interplay between the ego and that deeper spirit and how all those unresolved conflicts, they can really manifest out in the world.
And of course, this is just the beginning. Next time, we're going to be delving into Chapter 6, the Scission of the Spirit. It sounds like this journey into the psyche is going to keep unfolding.
It is. And as you go about your day, maybe think about what that bitter drink might be in your own life. What difficult truths or painful experiences are you avoiding that might actually be the key to a deeper understanding?
That's a really good question. Something to think about.
It is. Until next time.